Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge and our tutorial series on World in Flames Collector's Edition. In today's episode, we are finally getting to the heart of the game. The next several episodes will be discussing all the rules that cover how to move and fight with the units in the game. And we're going to start off with probably the most straightforward aspect of that, and that is movement of land units. Now, we're not going to only discuss the regular hex-to-hex movement of land units in this episode, but we're also going to discuss rail moves, and because they have an impact on both regular land movement and rail movement, we're going to talk about zones of control in a little bit of detail. So with that said, let's dive right in and get to it. Now, for this episode, it may be handy for you to reference the terrain effects chart, which is printed on the lower corner of the Pacific maps, but also on the back of the map set card cover. They have reproduced it. This is a little handier for you. Just before we begin, to help you understand how to read this particular chart, you can see they have the terrain types for full hex terrain and then hex side terrain listed here. And then there are some terrain that are within hexes and some other items. What we're going to be mostly focusing on today are the hex type terrains with the movement point costs you can see here. And they have the movement costs divided up first into European movement costs and Pacific map movement costs, as well as a column for off map. And the off map will be used for off map hexes or for anything on the Americas mini map. Now, within each of the Europe or Pacific scales, you also have the movement broken down by leg or by motorized. The only units that use the motorized movement costs are your HQ, or your armor HQs, armor units, mechanized units, and motorized units. So other than those four types, you'll be looking at the leg column here. And you can see for the various types of terrain, the movement costs are broken down. You can see that for motorized units, forest is going to cost 2 on the European maps as opposed to 1 for legs. If you are on the Pacific maps, forest movement cost jumps to 5, and for leg units it's going to be 3. And I'll let you kind of follow along if you'd like with this, and we'll get into some examples here of how exactly the movement rules work. Now, in World in Flames, on land counters, the right-hand factor is the movement allowance. This tells you how many movement points that particular unit has to move in a given impulse. Now, these movement points are expended as the unit moves from one hex to an adjacent hex to an adjacent hex. And you cannot save up these movement points from turn to turn. It's use them or lose them. You're never forced to move any units. It's totally voluntary unless as a result of a combat and they're forced to retreat. But the retreat's a little different than movement. So we'll talk about that in the combat episode. But here you see we have a German infantry corps and a German mechanized corps. So the infantry corps is going to be a leg mobile unit, while the mechanized corps is going to have to use the motorized costs. Simply, if we wanted to move this infantry corps from Hungary into Yugoslavia, it would cost 1 movement point to move into the clear terrain and a 2nd movement point to move into the forest. Now, if the infantry corps wanted to move into the mountain hex down here, it still has 1 movement point remaining. However, the cost for leg units to enter mountain on the European maps is 2, so it does not have enough movement points to pay the full cost. It can still move into that mountain hex. However, if it does so, it will be flipped face down when it does. So the movement is done for the entire turn, not just the impulse, unless it is subsequently reorganized. Now, for a motorized unit, cost would be 1 to move into the clear. Moving into the forest, the city, as you check the terrain effects chart, has no effect on movement. So we've spent 1 here. It's going to cost 2 to move into that forest. And again, if it wanted to continue into the mountain, in this case, it would cost 3. So we've already expended 3 movement points to get to this hex. So if we continue movement into here, it also would be turned face down and inverted. Keep in mind that weather also can affect terrain costs. If it is rain, storm, or blizzard in the weather zone, that will double all terrain costs, which means these mountain hexes now cost 4 movement points to enter for this leg movement instead of 2. Now, World in Flames does not have a rule that allows a unit to move at least 1 hex, regardless of how many movement points it has. However, the ability to enter a hex if you have at least 1 movement factor remaining, but not enough to pay for it, is functionally fairly similar. The result will be, however, that the unit will be turned face down. In this case, because it had not moved yet, it only has 3 movement points. And with the rain in the mountains, that's now 4, it can move into this hex, but it will be forced to turn face down and end its movement, not only for this impulse, but until it is reorganized and turned face up again. Now, a unit must be face up in order to use land movement. And if you have a stack of units, such as the 2 we have stacked here in Poland, you can move them either individually or you may move them as a stack. And it's important to remember that if you move them as a stack, each unit in the stack will count as a land move against the activity limit. So if you're doing a combined as Germany, were I to move this stack as a whole stack, it would be counted as 2 land moves against the limit. Now, when you move them as a stack, you will move them and you will keep track of the movement costs expended by each unit individually. So when they move into this forest hex, that's only going to be 1 for the infantry unit, but it will be 2 movement points for the mechanized unit. So at this point, it would be the 2nd movement point used for the infantry, but the 3rd for the mechanized. And when they reach this hex, the infantry unit will be out of movement points and no longer able to continue, while the mechanized would have 1 movement point left. You always use the slowest movement factor of a stack if you're going to keep the stack together. A moving stack, however, may choose to drop off units along the way. So they can begin moving as a stack, and as they move into hexes along the way, you can choose to drop off the unit. However, what you cannot do is start moving, enter a hex, and then pick up a unit along the way. So dropping off is allowed, but picking up is not. Now, a unit must stop when it has used its last remaining movement point or if it enters an enemy zone of control. So let's talk about zones of control for a minute, because they do have an impact on a wide variety of mechanisms in the game. Zones of control are exerted by any large or core-sized unit into the 6 hexes adjacent to it. And it's going to affect things like supply tracing, placement of reinforcements, garrison values, rail movement, land movement, partisan effects, even transporting resources and build points. And the way it works, quite simply, is as your unit is moving, if it enters, or rather when it enters an enemy zone of control, it must stop movement for the impulse, even though it has movement points remaining. So in this example, the Infantry Corps and the Mechanized Corps have only expended 1 movement point. They have 2 or 4 remaining, and yet they must stop for the turn. And the only exception is if they then immediately conduct an overrun of the unit that's exerting the zone of control on them. And we'll talk about overruns in the next episode, Land Combat. But for now, just know that as you're moving along, when you enter an enemy zone of control, you must stop for the impulse. So you can see that what this implies, or what this allows you to do, is to set up sort of a cordon with your units defensively, allowing them to cover a wider area of land with fewer units. And it's going to stop the enemy from charging right through. However, land units can begin their impulse or their move in an enemy zone of control, and they are allowed to move directly to another hex that's adjacent and also in an enemy zone of control where they would have to stop. So you can see that this cordon will not stop the enemy cold, but it will slow them down as it takes them a couple of impulses to sort of ooze through the gaps in the line. Now, there are some limitations on zones of control. Zones of control do not extend into or out of off-map hexes, They also do not extend into hex dots. Neither do they extend across alpine hex sides, which are these white hex sides here, or across all sea hex sides, across straits or unfrozen lake hex sides, or into a hex with which you are not at war. So, in this example here, you can see the German mechanized corps in this mountain hex will exert a zone of control into this desert hex and into the forest hex with the port, as well as this mountain hex. But because of the lake hex side here, there is no zone of control in this hex. Similarly, because of the alpine hex sides here and here, there's no zone of control here, and there's no zone of control here. Likewise, the infantry corps will not exert a zone of control into roads or the island hex here across these straits hex sides. And if the corps were here in the port, it would not exert a zone of control into the notional hex there represented by the hex dot. Finally, let's talk about rail movement. Rail movement is a form of strategic movement that you use when you want to redeploy a unit over a long distance in a short amount of time. For example, you are looking to move some units from the Pacific coast here around Vladivostok over to central Russia, or even perhaps as far as the East Front here in Poland. Let's take a look at some of the specifics of how we accomplish that in World in Flames. Now, in order for a unit to use rail movement, it must be face up, and it must begin and end its rail move in a station. A station is defined as any port, any city, or any friendly or cooperating headquarters. So, in our example here, if this German infantry corps were to use regular land movement to try to reach Belgrade, it would take 1, 2, 3, 4, it would take 4 impulses to get from Dubrovnik to Belgrade due to the movement point cost of the mountains between there and Belgrade. However, with rail movement, we simply pick the unit up at its station and then move along the rail line from hex to hex until we reach the destination, where we turn it face down. So in a single impulse, it is moved from Dubrovnik to Belgrade using the rail lines along the way. Now, it's important you must stay on the rail line. So when you're moving along the rail line east of Sarajevo, for example, and you reach this mountain hex here, you would not be able to move directly to this hex with the resource in it, nor to this hex here with these rail lines in it, because there's no line connecting these hexes directly. You would first have to move into the forest hex, and then from here, you could either exit into this mountain hex along the rail line, or you can make the turn and come south this way. In this hex, you could even branch off and end up in Sofia. Now, you'll notice that because headquarters count as stations, whatever hex they happen to be in, as long as they start the impulse face up in a hex with a rail line, they are able to use rail movement, and they can move along the rail lines to any hex where they can stop their movement and then be turned face down. They are, in effect, their own station at the beginning and end of the movement. Some restrictions on rail movement are that all of the hexes that you move through must be friendly controlled when you move through them, and you may not move through any enemy zones of control. So in the situation we have here with a Soviet mechanized corps north of the rail line running east from Sarajevo, the infantry corps would not be able to rail to Belgrade, because as soon as it reached this hex here, it would be in the enemy zone of control, and it would be able to move no further. And since this is not a station, then the unit could not legally end its move there. So it would only be able to rail to Sarajevo legally in this particular example. Now, a unit may rail out of a hex that is in an enemy zone of control, but only if there is another friendly unit that stays in that hex both before and after the rail movement. So in this case, if we wanted to rail the Rommel headquarters, if we wanted the Rommel's headquarters to use rail movement, we could do this because we have another friendly unit in the infantry corps that is in the hex. We would move Rommel out to the west through Sarajevo to wherever he wants to end up, maybe say Zagreb, and this unit, however, is going to be basically stuck there for this impulse. Likewise, you can rail into a hex that is in a zone of control if there is a friendly unit already located there and that stays there. So Rommel could move from split, he could come along the rail line, and he would have to stop his movement as soon as he entered the enemy zone of control, but because the infantry corps is there, he would be able to make this a legal rail move. Rail moves are also limited in the quantity that may be done in any given impulse. If you look on the allowable activities chart, you will see that rail movement is only allowed in an air, land, or combined impulse. And the letters here are going to reference us down to the major power activities limits. In the air and land, we'll use column E, and you can see that each major power gets a variable number of them, whereas in a combined, everyone is limited to a single rail move. Now, what constitutes a rail move? If you move a unit anywhere within the same map or one map away, that's counted as a single rail move. If you move them 2 maps away, it's counted as 2 rail moves, and 3 maps away is 3 rail moves. So you can see here the seam between the 2 European maps. If a unit were to start in Spain and rail to France or even rail to Poland, that would count as a single rail move. If you wanted to send the unit, however, from Spain all the way across Europe into Siberia, that would count as 2 rail moves. And if you wanted to get them all the way along to Vladivostok here, that would be a total of 3 rail moves consumed for that single unit. Now, units are not the only thing that you may rail. You may also rail blue factories in your home country. And we see here a blue factory at Vitebsk in Russia. In order to keep that blue factory from falling into enemy hands, you may want to rail that to a safer location in your home country, in which case the factory would use the same rules as a unit, and it would move along the rail lines just as a unit did. And if you were to move it into Siberia, it would be placed there. The factory is unusable for a period of time during the transportation, and we'll talk about that in the production video. But just know that you may also rail factories in addition to land units and air units. Naval units cannot be railed. Factories also cost more to rail. So to rail a factory on the same map or to 1 map away, it would cost 2 rail moves. 2 maps away would be 3, and if you want to send it 3 maps away, it's going to cost you 4 rail moves. Just one last thing about rail moves. In an air action, you're only allowed to rail move air units, while in a land action, you're only allowed to rail land units. However, in a combined action, you are allowed to rail either one, and naval units may never be rail moved. And that pretty much covers movement of land units in World in Flames. The regular land movement is pretty straightforward, just paying your movement point costs from hex to hex. And keep in mind that if you don't have enough to pay for that next hex, you can still enter it, but then you'll be inverted. And with rail moves, you just want to keep in mind that it's from station to station along a continuous rail line, which makes those rail lines printed on the map that much more important. And keep in mind the effects of zones of control, both on regular land movement as well as rail movement. That's going to do it for this episode. Next up, we'll take a look at how your land units are going to fight when we examine the systems in World in Flames they use for land combat. Thanks for watching today, and we'll see you next time.